So thank you very much. It's lovely to see everyone. We're going to try and keep this panel as discussion-based as we can. So I've encouraged the panelists not to use slides, and we'll see how that goes. But do feel free to jump in, think of questions. And for those online, please do put questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and then we'll make sure to leave time for all right, I think I'm back. Great. So okay, I'm back again. So we're gonna keep going through this because we're online. I think they can only hear us when I'm on the microphone. So just to sort of keep them engaged, I'm gonna pause if it ever shuts off. So the motivation for this panel, which we've titled Reconstructing Accountability Narratives to Center the Interests and Priorities of Affected Communities, really sort of starts from threefold sets of sort of assumptions or starting points. So the first, from the idea that accountability to affected people matters in the humanitarian sector, and that's been long established over sort of the last 20 or 30 years, but that's what's been going on to try to understand what accountability to affected people looks like, how do we do it, what it looks like to do it well, is really not so well understood, and that there has been, and there is sort of a strong consensus that things are not really working to live up to commitments as intended. On the other side, and where sort of the motivation for this panel really sits, is that there's a disjuncture between how accountability is understood, how it's talked about, how we think about the challenges around accountability in the sector, and how else it might be understood in some of the communities and countries in which we operate, in which there are other actors that are accountability actors that are working to think about what it looks like to be accountable to people within a society, within a political entity. To specifically, we think about local media sectors, journalists, and civil society. And that's, it really seems that some of the discussions that are going on in the humanitarian sector around what is accountability, what it looks like to do it well, why are we just not sort of getting to where we want to get, are quite detached from perhaps these other discussions of accountability that might be going on in the places that we're operating. And so the motivation of this panel then was some work that was done by Somali Public Agenda with ODI last year, and will be published in the next month or so, that really sought to look at, well, in the context of Somalia, how is accountability being spoken about among civil society actors, among local journalists, among some of the major players in the media sector, in the local media sector? How do they see their challenges? And is there anything that we can learn or link up to within the humanitarian sector to help better think about what it looks like to be accountable, what the challenges are, and how we might move past them? And so with that, we've convened this panel, not just to talk about that research, but to use it as a launching point to think about accountability in the wider context of the places that we operate, and how this might help us to better understand where we're at with the AAP agenda, what the challenges are, and where we might be headed, and how we could do this in different ways. So to introduce our panel, we have to my far right, Meg Sattler, who is a CEO at Grand True Solutions. Next to her is Abdurrahman Sharif, who is Quality and Impact Director for West and Central Africa for Save the Children International. And online, we have Mahad Wasuge, who is Executive Director of Somali Public Agenda and lead architect between this work that we've been doing and thinking about in the context of Somalia. And all have had quite extensive experience in grappling with some of these different questions about accountability, what it looks like, what it means practically, and within specific contexts. And so just to start off, what I'm going to do for the structure of this panel is I'm going to give each of our panelists around 10 or 12 minutes to sort of introduce their thoughts around these questions and to take it in what direction they would like. I'll then open it up to a discussion amongst our panelists for another sort of 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to a wider discussion. And please, online, as I said, do type in your questions as you think about them so that we have them ready and we can bring you into the discussion. So first, I'll start with Meg Settler, who's going to kick us off. Meg has worked on accountability issues extensively in her role as CEO of Ground Truth Solutions, which is a not-for-profit research organization specializing in surveying affected people in crisis contexts. And again, one of the sort of motivations for actually even kickstarting this research that we were doing was a paper that Meg wrote in 2021, where she explained where the humanitarian sector was at around the accountability agenda in a report for the Humanitarian Advisory Group titled Stuck in the Weeds, which gives a bit of an indication of some of the issues that the paper was grappling with. And so Meg is going to provide us with an introduction then to thinking about what is state of the art in accountability in the humanitarian sector, what are the challenges, and how might we think about it in wider contexts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. It's nice to be here and good to see some people in the audience who have been in the trenches with me on accountability for a while. It's kind of a weird time at the moment, and I think it's quite important to note that we're living in a time where accountability as a concept can feel a bit hard to believe in, I think. And I think for this discussion, it's nice for us to pretend that we don't just exist in the humanitarian sector, that we sort of, excuse me, exist in the world. And in the world, accountability has a certain meaning that sometimes gets a little bit lost in humanitarian action. On the plane over here, I watched a film called The Zone of Interest, which is about the director of Auschwitz camp during the Holocaust. And it sort of focused on his life, living a quite normal life despite what was going on behind the wall of his house. And it had a really profound impact on me. And I think this feeling of existing in the world, sitting in this room, being in this conference center, when we see what's happening, you know, in Rafah, in Congo, in other places, it's really difficult. And it's a little bit, you feel very guilty and weird about it. And so I think we have to do our best to make all these discussions really mean something. I wrote in the GTS newsletter last week that I was saying to our founder that it's quite weird to be working on accountability at a time when it feels like there is none. And I think it's just such a heavy term. Humanitarian space, but we all talk ad nauseum about the ways that we're doing accountability. We have an AAP officer, we have an AAP approach, we have a feedback mechanism, we have a hotline, we have a working group, we have a framework. And while all of this is happening and all these accountability mechanisms exist, there are three things that really remain true based on a lot of the work that GTS has done. One is that most people don't feel that aid is accountable, whether or not they've come into contact with one of these many mechanisms. Two is that aid continues to be largely irrelevant to people in many places, which results in this widespread resale of aid products, which puts vulnerable people at additional risk. And three is that there are very few, I put no initially and then I changed it, there are very few real repercussions for bad aid programming. And this is a sector in which bad programming risks people's lives. And if you compare that to something like the health sector, it's treated very differently. So if we then suppose that we should stop this smoke and mirrors approach of doing accountability, that we kind of have doing accountability covered by now, there are two areas of accountability where some improvement would probably go quite a long way. And so the first one is this concept of being held to account. Who holds someone accountable? And it generally isn't the person who isn't doing the best job. I think some level of internal accountability obviously is essential, but who is really holding aid actors accountable? And to some extent, it's actors like ours at GTS, it's media, it's civil society, but I think the potential there is not fully utilised. It can't be the UN coordination team who is in charge of holding the sector accountable. And even us at Ground Truth, we've been told in several places now, you know, your work is not in our accountability strategy, so you don't need to be here. And, you know, I didn't really realise that that's how accountability worked. But this is what happens when a sector is considered exceptional, as the humanitarian sector is. And I think we all need to challenge this idea a little bit more. Of course, it's very easy to say then organisations at local and national level, as well as sort of fully independent actors globally, need to be supported to play a more external accountability role, and that will make everything better. That's obviously also not without complexity. I think at global level, support for independent actors is really hard to find. I did a podcast on this on True Humanitarian last week. And at local level, there are a lot of other complexities. You know, the aim is to improve support, not bring it down. And sometimes, you know, there's a bit of a disconnect between the conversations in Western universities about burning down the whole aid system and the fact that that concept is quite frightening to some people at local level who want aid to be better, but they certainly don't want to fuel certain anti-international sentiments in places where they're also taking hold. And there are a lot of competing agendas. And I think the Somalia research that will be showed shortly will show us how some of these things can be approached in a more nuanced way. And the second thing is about being accountable. And this is really about transparency. And interestingly, in our work, we ask questions on a number of metrics, and the transparency one is always the worst one. And we actually only started asking it a couple of years ago. But if we ask people what they expect from the humanitarian sector versus what they experience of the humanitarian sector, they expect the most when it comes to transparency, and they experience it in the worst possible way. So they feel like they want to know more about what's going on, but they just don't. And it's very hard to find that information. Yesterday, there was a session from the Red Cross movement about their trust index, and this was also their worst finding when they were talking to different national societies. And so maybe spending less time setting up quite tightly controlled mechanisms and more time better explaining what we're all doing would go quite a long way. Yesterday, I was talking to David from the Edelman Trust Barometer, and he said transparency is not just about owning up to and fixing mistakes, which the humanitarian sector sort of tries to do sometimes when it gets caught out for something, but it's about showing on an ongoing basis that your house is in order. And I thought that was a really nice way to put it. The humanitarian sector, I think, is terrible at this, and we could do a lot better. And finally, I think I would just argue that being accountable to people affected by crisis in many places does involve a serious look at what needs to be prioritised in terms of programming. Most priorities at the community level are not short-term aid, and the way that the sector is progressing and this intersection we have of climate crises, financial crises, long-term needs, geopolitical tensions, that sort of can't stay in the too hard basket despite all of its complexity. So I'll stop there, but they're just my initial thoughts on that question. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Meg. That was great, and a great sort of start to laying out just what is it that we are talking about when we're thinking about where the sector is sitting and what the actual challenges to accountability are. As Meg referenced, I'd like to bring in Mahad now to pick up where Meg left off and maybe bring in some of the reflections from the recent work and also the wider work that Somalia Public Agenda has been doing in Somalia, thinking around questions of accountability in the humanitarian sector and also more broadly in Somali society. So Mahad, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Meg, as well for framing the discussion in a nice way. And I'm joining this discussion from Mogadishu, Somalia, where I'm based. And Meg has talked about now two main areas of accountability. Number one is the being accountable, being transparency. The focus of this of our studies is the second one, which is who holds the humanitarian and agencies and organizations accountable. and that is what role are the civil society and the media is playing in making them accountable. So the study is not yet final. We are about to publish it soon. We examined the domestic factors, the perspectives and actors who shape and can advance humanitarian accountability initiatives in Somalia. And we examined and explored how different actors in Somalia are engaged on accountability issues, and also the political economy dynamics which shape their activities, the work they do, and the preliminary findings of the study show that there is first a low level of awareness and understanding of accountability, particularly among the affected population communities that receive the aid. The lack of awareness is largely due to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Somalia and the need for immediate emergency aid. The affected population basically do not get the chance to think of accountability as they deal with cyclical droughts, floods, and also conflicts. They need the presence and support of aid organizations, so they don't think much of making them accountable. And this means that there is no notable demand of accountability at the community level in Somalia. The study also found that the donors of humanitarian aid are the main shapers of accountability in Somalia, as they commission studies and third-party monitoring and work to investigate the efficiency of the interventions they financed. Even in this case, the local people are only interviewed and expressed interview fatigue. There is a constant data collection done, and do not have major input on what to investigate and how the interventions should be redesigned to make it more effective. So we examined three actors. The first is the civil society, and the second is the media, and then the government. So if we start with the civil society organizations, we did not find initiatives that are advancing transparency and accountability in the humanitarian sector in Somalia, but we found some initiatives. One of it is one program we found during the study called the Ahia Citizen Engagement Program. Uses several approaches and methods to engage citizens, including field research, interactive radio talks, and hotline numbers, community forums, conversations with policymakers and practitioners, and also online interactive dashboards. The program, although it's just in its early stage, envision is to maintain a two-way communication structure and inform and educate citizens on while also hearing and documenting their feedback on the emergence, the priorities they have and the situation they are in. It's not only on accountability on aid, it also covers on other areas, but it's one of these civil society programs that partly do some work that relates to documenting people's views and priorities. The study did not find any other notable efforts conducted independently by civil society to promote humanitarian accountability in Somalia. The Somali-led consulting companies and firms play limited role, particularly when they work as third-party monitoring and consultants for donors that commission this type of work. And for doing this, they also are making some income and profit. So their work isn't primarily centered on holding the humanitarian agents accountable on behalf of the community. The key civil society roles in general are missing in Somalia, such as to properly advocate for accountability, raise awareness, hold humanitarian organizations accountable with the purpose of improving the aid and services for the wider community. So that is the where we are at the civil society level. On local media, their role is also not that much. There are no local media outlets that focus on humanitarian accountability related reporting. The several systematic barriers also are faced by the media. Media stations are mostly owned by individuals who have the intention to make profit. They emphasize on covering news about politics and are not often interested in humanitarian accountability issues, which are in general a lot less likely to attract major audiences in the country. Additionally, local media capacity is generally limited to covering hard news. Reporting on humanitarian accountability requires specialized investigative skills and resources for and field work and information gathering, which are also lacking in Somali media outlets. There are also few journalists who are capable of reporting on humanitarian issues, but they face challenges such as their own safety and security, limited information access, and editorial priorities as well that might not align with covering humanitarian topics. They also lack the necessary approvals and access to report comprehensively on these issues. The currently local media contribution to humanitarian affairs is limited to reporting on disasters and the general humanitarian needs in affected areas and when humanitarian aid is distributed. So the third actor we examined what they are doing on accountability in humanitarian sector is the government. The Ministry of Planning of the federal government put in place several policies and frameworks, including the National Development Plan, the 9th National Development Plan, M&E policy, M&E framework. They also, in collaboration with the development partners, the government launched the Aid Management Information System, which contains information on several hundred projects, including project objectives, funding amounts, implementing areas, duration of the project, implementing agents, and this type of information. But in general, these the government policies are not effectively or actively implemented or enforced. Even how far the National Development Plan and M&E framework is implemented in Somalia is really very, very limited. And the government is contributing to enhance accountability, at least in terms of developing policies and frameworks, rather than putting more focus on and emphasis on the implementation of these policies and frameworks. The proper implementation of these efforts is missing, and or at least it is at least not effective. So that is when we look on the collaboration on the relationship between these three actors, the civil society, the media, and the government, we found that there's no a meaningful collaboration and coordination among these stakeholders when it comes to accountability in general, and also humanitarian accountability in particular. We found out several major challenges that accountability in the aid sector in Somalia is facing. Number one is limited understanding and of accountability by the affected population. Second is lack of access to necessary information on accountability and on humanitarian projects. So really, the data even is not accessible in many ways to even the federal government. There's also limited capacity and resources and expertise in all government, civil society, and media and sectors. Fourth, there is an absence of personal security and job security in Somali media. So there a lot of people who might like to do some work are also have some security concerns, which is legitimate and evident. There's also a lack of political commitment in our view and political will in promoting humanitarian accountability in Somalia. There's also an absence of local community input and perspectives on the implementation of humanitarian projects. The humanitarian agencies actually are the gatekeepers of the information related to humanitarian and aid in the country, and they withhold. They don't even have a proper mechanism to share this data among themselves. And finally, there is an overlapping, also unclear mandates among various government institutions that involve or do play some role in humanitarian interventions in Somalia. So that's where we are at when it comes to civil society and the media making the humanitarian agencies accountable to what they do. And I think being accountable is really here also very important. What role are the humanitarian agencies playing to be accountable, be more collaborative to the government, and be transparent in the work they do. That's also missing in Somali context. So these are the let me stop here, and later on I can come in for the way forward and what needs to be done. Over to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahad. Yeah, that was really fascinating to hear, and I think a lot of interesting parallels to think of perhaps some of the common challenges around thinking about questions of transparency, power shifts, how accountability isn't understood both from within the humanitarian sector and more widely in Somalia, that look slightly different on both sides, but share some sort of common bigger challenges as well, and sort of thinking about why we're not seeing perhaps much change. I have some thoughts, but I'm going to hand over actually straight to Abdurrahman to follow up on Meg and Mahad, and then come back in for a bit of a discussion. Thanks. Good.
Thank you very much, Megan and Mahad, for setting this scene for this discussion on accountability. I was going to start talking about, well, let me introduce myself, but I'm as of 1.5 months in this new role with Save the Children as a regional director for program development, quality, and impact. And actually, one of the functions that sits under me within the regional office is the meal function, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, which in the organization has also that responsibility to look at accountability to affected people. And one of the reasons I wanted to look more at this area is because of my past experience. I worked for 2 years, well, for 6 years in Somalia with the NGO Consortium as a director, but also for 2 years in the government. And I wanted to reflect a bit for what Mahad said initially about, you know, how accountability plays in that context. And whenever, you know, you ask agencies, what have you done on this project? What have you done on this area? What have you done about this? I mean, the feeling was that they're not really accountable to you. They're accountable to the entity that gives the money to the organization. And that's the reality of how accountability functions in this day and era. Some actually academics in Africa talking about, you know, the international development and humanitarian system and looking at governance structures of accountability, they talk about, you know, the fact that you have a state, but you also have a parallel state. And our modus operandi, or the way we work, is really dominated by the parallel state, where priorities are set by the entity that provides the money for these projects. And so when you want to even say, you know, that things from the prioritization perspective are wrong, you are in a difficult position. And most of the time, you can't win this battle because the power is in those who give the money. That said, I was going to start my conversation by talking about our, you know, all the amazing feedback mechanisms we have in West and Central Africa, but Meg just told me that, you know, I have to put that in the dustbin for now. But that's the reality in which, you know, we live in. And for example, as Save the Children, the organization prioritizes a lot, you know, well, it is because of its focus on children, it's all about child participation in the process. And it's in its strategy, AAP, accountability to affected people, is part of our conversations around shifting the power, because, you know, it's about transferring power to the affected communities. We have a key performance indicator under which countries have to report on percentages of projects in which children are informed about the project and participate in decision making. And the organization also asks whether the data was used to adapt the project or program. That said, I mean, my personal reflections on this is that from a practical point of view, AAP is looked more as a process, a practice, rather than from a rights perspective, I would say. As Meg said, it's interpreted as a feedback mechanism, and to be honest, you know, these are very sophisticated. We use, you know, community volunteers, toll-free phone lines, help desks, surveys, WhatsApp messaging, SMS messaging, all the latest digital tools to get that feedback. But it also, to a certain extent, misses the point, because it doesn't take into consideration the concerns of affected populations towards their unmet needs, but also grievances, not just, you know, with the humanitarian agencies, but also with the other power brokers that affect the humanitarian system. The different levels of power, for example, gatekeepers that you have in between, you know, the communities and the agency. But also collecting, you know, the feedback itself is always extremely challenging. How do you get feedback from areas that are difficult to access? Do you have, you know, appropriate human and financial resources to collect the information? How do you triangulate the feedback, particularly when you try and get, you know, feedback from populations that are marginalized or silenced because they're scared that, you know, if they say something wrong, they might not receive aid the next day. But also in getting people to understand how to use this data to improve the quality and impact of projects, right? And perhaps, you know, this is one of the most important aspects of accountability to affected people. And when you're dealing with collecting data and you're a country office dealing with so many priorities, so many projects, so many different challenges, you're more focused on burn rates, meeting reporting deadlines, than accountability to affected people. And that's the reality on the ground. Obviously, we should be concerned about, you know, the ethical dilemmas of our engagement with affected communities, but in reality, this, you know, we serve, let's say, the interests, as I said, the needs of being accountable towards the donor. That is here, well, historically, how I guess humanitarian accountability came about, as a tool to be accountable to the donor, not to the people. And we haven't really moved away from that in a sense. We've tried to put in efforts to do that, but there's still more work to do. And as I said, you know, the other big challenge of accountability to affect people is that we don't look at it from a rights perspective. And one of the other examples, I used to work with Internews, which is an organization that works with information providers. And I know ICRC insists a lot on that. They see the right to information as a basic human right. People have the right to get information about what's happening in their local contexts, where there is assistance, where there's no assistance, and as much as possible. And so, you know, from a rights perspective, shouldn't be the right of the affected population to have a say in anything that affects their lives. And if that's the case, and if we believe that's right, do we offer the spaces for them to express themselves freely and without any repercussions? And it's fair to say, you know, that we, for example, here sitting in Geneva, we're used to working in democratic societies where people express themselves freely, criticize when they're not happy, and you know, express their discontent through elections or the use of tools such as, you know, the media. But in conflict-affected states, that's different, right? You don't tend to work in democratic societies where people can speak freely about their challenges. And also, they work under systems of power brokers, patrons, and people who in this system are afraid to lose out if, you know, any form of feedback was to be negative. And please let me know if I go beyond my time, but the third point I'd like to highlight is as I said, you know, the reason why we started talking about accountability historically in the first place is mentioned, I think, in the, well, accountability to affect people is mentioned in the synthesis report that the WHS issued during its consultations. And it says, humanitarian action should support the efforts and capacities of affected people to help them cope in times of crisis, and that humanitarian actors should recognize that affected people are the central actors in their own survival and recovery. In essence, to me, what this means is that affected populations are not subjects. They are the drivers of the humanitarian response. Yet, I think we often perceive them as subjects. They are means to an end. We don't look at the added value that they bring to a project or program if we involve communities. We look at it from a process perspective. And I believe that the idea of accountability to affected people is also that the closer you are to the problem, the quicker it is to find a solution to it, right? Quick fixes, resolving things quickly if we identify a problem. So it's not just empowering affected communities, but it's also about trying to decentralize decision-making within any entity or any humanitarian agency. But, you know, our overtly bureaucratic systems require different levels of approvals from the top, and that makes it difficult to put in place quick, localized solutions to problems. So the last point I want to perhaps mention is the fact that, you know, responsibilities around AAP, accountability to affected people, is not clear. Most of the time, you know, organizations do prioritize it at the top level, leadership level. But in practice, the responsibility generally relies with whoever is dealing with meal, as I said. But the question is it just the responsibility of that individual or person who deals with monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning? I think certainly for them, it is about managing the process, but there are different people or different actors that need to be involved in the process of decision-making, or making sure that, you know, the information we get does reflect or does make changes to our projects and programs on the ground. That said, there are still good areas where accountability to affected people is working. For instance, I mean, at the Save the Children, I can say that whenever there are instances of, fraud, PSEA or safeguarding, this is highlighted. It goes all the way at the top and it takes a priority and it is immediately addressed as a matter of urgency. But there are other areas that, need to have the same influence or impact within the organization and any organization. So this is a bit my reflections, but what can we change and where can we go from here? I think for me, it's about an organizational cultural shift that needs to happen towards a rights-based approach. Look at this. I think the engagement with our communities and the affected communities needs to be driven by organizational culture rather than specific individuals, staff, or even the leadership. I think we need to invest, yes, in the right number of staff and right number of training for these people. And we need to strengthen also decision-making processes that allow for a quick course correction. One final point I wanted to mention, and we had a brief conversation with John earlier about this, is the question of being lost in translation. When you translate accountability, and Mahad referred to this in another language, it loses the meaning, right? So in French, it's redevabilité. If you ask me, I'm a Francophone as well. Redevabilité, what does it mean? I have no idea. So you can imagine, the person on the ground, and you can imagine that, in Somali, Mahad, if you translate accountability, I'm sure it's going to be a new, interesting word, but you lose the sense of it. And so the way we perceive accountability is not the way others perceive it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdurrahman. That was great and really provocative. I think what I want to do now is I have sort of 4 brief reflections on what you've all said, and I want to hand it back over to some specific questions and to sort of have your own reflections, probably starting with Meg, just to give you a heads up. I mean, thinking across what all 3 of you were saying, I think it's sort of the heart of thinking about accountability is this idea of a shift in power. And the shift of power almost needs to take place in 2 ways. One, sort of generally shift in power to affected communities, to put them in positions where they are people, they're in the driver's seat and thinking about decisions within these sort of exceptional crisis contexts, but also a shift in power and thinking about sort of AAP itself, from a narrative that has been focused on reporting to donors to actually being about accountability to affected people. And those are not the same things, and one doesn't mean the other. And so from that, I sort of pulled out maybe, let's say, 5 quick different elements of where we might focus the change to think about those shifts. And I'd be curious about your thoughts on, and your sort of general reflections on how you sort of see where the most effective change could take place. So Abdurrahman, you spoke about change within organizations to a right-based approach, and that's sort of a culture shift within the sectors. That's not necessarily thinking about who we're working with, the methods that we're using, how we're working in communities, but actually within organizations themselves, this is not going to go anywhere unless there's a sort of internal process of organizational change. That wasn't the only thing you spoke about, but that was one. The second was a sort of back to the sort of question of power about who needs to be involved for accountability to affected communities work. And I think what was interesting with some of Maha's reflections was that there are gatekeepers in the media sector. There's issues in civil society. There's issues in the governments and a lot of places that we're working with. There's not a sort of perfect accountability actor, but we need to be thinking about who should be the gatekeepers, who has legitimacy to represent interests, because we're never going to sort of get every single aid recipient's views, right? There's always an intermediary and there's always a process of representation. So is it a question about who? Or third, is it a question of how? Abdurrahman, you spoke about how you're using really interesting feedback mechanisms, 2-way communications, trying to get information provision in new ways, going to the media that people are using. Is it that the methods are wrong, or is it that who is implementing the methods wrong? Would it be better if this was being done through local media with all of its issues in Somalia? Or is there something fundamentally problematic in terms of how, quote unquote, we are trying to do accountability to be accountable? Fourth, the fourth, sorry, goodbye. The fourth challenge, a potential area of change. So we think about change in terms of internally in organizations, change in terms of who is doing it, how we're doing it. The fourth was sort of how we're talking about it and how we're actually defining accountability. And I think, Abdurrahman, this came up actually across all three of you. And is accountability the right word, or is it actually, what are we trying to do in the humanitarian sector? Is it not accountability? Because accountability is quite a political reality in many ways. And is it more about just doing what we're saying, doing with projects and having it reflect a different set of interests? Is that accountability? Maybe there's something about the terms. And if we're thinking the Somali context, in different dialects of Somali, are there other words that would make more sense to communicate what good would look like within the sort of amorphous space of accountability that we're talking about? And then sort of the fifth area, maybe six, or I've lost track of my area of change that I thought was interesting, and this goes back right to the beginning, is around, Meg, when you're talking about sort of this point in time where we seem to be in the sector that just isn't accountable, and it's quite depressing in many ways, but this sort of question about risk and like the risk of, there's sort of a risk about a sense of like, if we are accountable, what does that then mean? Because you can shift accountability in some ways, but if we're going to do information provision in a way that enables the sector to be held to account, what does that mean in a time where everything seems quite precarious and we're quite worried about funding and having the basic resources to operate across a wide variety of like quite difficult, protracted, large scale conflicts and crisis situations? And so is it that we need to sort of shift the idea of what's the risk of not being held to account versus accountability as a risk? Or is it that accountability is a risk at this point in time, and maybe we need to take that seriously? So from that, I guess, attempt to summarize, I'd be quite interested to go back to you, Meg, and see, how do you see practically, I mean, this is a lot, sort of quite heavy, what are the sort of points of change that are most important to you, or what do you think we need to be prioritizing across the sort of space of, all of these things are probably a problem, but how do we prioritize and how do we sort of think about where we should be putting our efforts in terms of trying to enable a shift from where we are now to something that is more about accountability as being held to account, about the communities themselves being in positions of power? Over to you.
Very easy series of questions there. And I've been taking a lot of notes when everyone's been talking, because, you know, you sort of think about some of these issues in quite a simple way, and then you think, oh, but that wouldn't work because that's quite complicated, and you can't just do that because that's even more complicated. And I started thinking about, at the moment, you know, as I said, and I think as we've all sort of alluded to, at the moment, accountability is very held by the sector that is trying to be held accountable. So that doesn't really work. And I think in terms of your question about who should be involved, though, it does get more complicated, because I think there needs to be an attempt to let go of control, and that needs to come from a number of different areas, from local media, from civil society, from general publics, etc. But there's no easy solution on accountability, as I mentioned in my gloomy Gaza-inspired opening remarks. I do think the role of media is underutilized. It is also very complicated. And I was thinking about it when both you and Mahad were talking. If you think about when the media has been used to hold the sector accountable, you could flag the Oxfam SEA issue. In Australia, after the bushfire response, media was able to quite publicly question the response of the Red Cross, because in the Red Cross's defence, they had been quite transparent about their spending and their planning. That sort of enabled savvy citizens and civil society to flag and ask the right questions. I would say that's a place where the governmental sort of regulations helped that along. So that also then brings in this role of government. Another place where the media has been incredible at holding aid accountable, and this might be a bit controversial at the moment, is Haiti. I mean, that's a place where people know so much about aid. And when I was working there after the earthquake, international media was reporting so much on overhead costs, as you probably remember. You know, the Red Cross has spent this much on overhead, World Vision has spent this much on overhead. The local media was pointing out very accurately bad programming with a lot of nuance. They were pointing out the limited accountability, but what that did was fuel a lot of violence. And so I know that you've sold out and left into news and gone to Save the Children, but that's where I do think that having feedback mechanisms that work and influence change are an essential part of the equation, because that would have avoided that whole process. If you were able to sort of listen better and say, how could we actually change something based on the way that we're listening to communities? So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think very much linked to this are narratives and public understanding of aid in general. And I think public understanding of aid is very immature, which makes it very difficult for civil society in a number of different places to hold it accountable. You did ask about solutions, and I know I don't have many, but I do keep coming back to this point about transparency. Like, it comes up so much in the research, it comes up so much in positive examples of when accountability has been enabled. And I just think fundamentally, as a sort of principle, the more honest you are about what you're doing, the better you have to be. And if we were sort of able to look at what are the levers or the incentives for that transparency, you know, to some extent, what are the risks that come with that? We get a lot of pushback at country level about, well, we can't be accountable because, you know, we will get mobbed or, you know, whatever. And sometimes there is some validity to that. But, you know, the aid sector is not an expert in transparency, but a lot of civil society organizations actually are. So I think there's a lot that we could learn from various other actors if we were sort of brave enough to let go of control enough to do so.
Thank you so much, Meg. Mahad, would you like to come in from that? I know you had some thoughts as well about solutions. And I think that last point about learning from civil society, the role of the media sector, I think would be really interesting to hear your thoughts around that space.
Yeah, thanks. And Stephanie, I do agree with Meg that the media is underutilized, and the media landscape in Somalia itself needs to be understood as well, and what role they can play in accountability, because they have ownership structures and that are in many ways linked with the political economy of in Somalia. So they have some reasons not to investigate the aid and humanitarian interventions in Somalia. And one of the, I think, and this is partly this is part of the wider problem in Somalia. It's accountability is not, we are not talking about accountability in the aid sector in Somalia. We are talking about accountability in general. It's really, and there are no much organizations, both media and civil society working on this. And I have the feeling that in humanitarian sector and in many other sectors, a lot of stakeholders are actually happy with the status quo. If you look at the humanitarian agencies working in Somalia, Somalia is a hot cake for them. They get a lot of money for just responding to emergencies, and then millions are spent on emergency response, and less is focused on preventing these humanitarian emergencies and building the structures that could help address the sources of this vulnerability. And everyone is making fortunes. Sadly, the owners of the humanitarian organizations in Somalia are rich, and no one is asking how they ended up getting these fortunes. And they have their network with the government, and it's really the political economy of aid in Somalia. Seems that everyone is happy with the status quo. And that makes any suggestion of a way forward, a solution, really very challenging. When the key stakeholders are okay, with how things are at the moment, you alone cannot push for accountability. It needs political commitment. It needs integrity. It needs accountability within the aid in the sector. It needs a vibrant media and civil society organizations who are willing to spare and invest some of their time and resources covering this news and doing some work on how transparently the aid sector is in Somalia. So there are a lot of actors who should be collaborating, but the main problem I see is there is no such effort, and the status quo seems to be more okay with all of these stakeholders, and so that's I think the main problem in Somalia, and I don't think in one actor can fix this. It needs collective responsibility, collective accountability, and leadership in the government that demand transparency and accountability, not only in the aid sector, but also in all other sectors. And I think that would be a key, a good way to start and reform on advancing accountability in the aid sector in Somalia.
Thank you, Mahad. Yeah, important, also a bit sobering as well to sort of think about actually what is required to shift accountability in a meaningful way, given that wider political economy. Abdurrahman, do you want to come in and your thoughts on solutions? Where's the point of change that we need to focus on? We can focus on.
I think just to bring in the point of Mahad, I think saying everybody is happy with the status quo is I think, you know, the whole argument is about how we're going to shift power, right? Transfer power to those who have the status quo so that they can be held accountable. The challenge is that, you know, in accountability and I mean, in for example, in again, in the West, governments normally tend to establish or get the support of independent bodies to hold them accountable, right? Or civil society holds them accountable, or citizens groups. And I think the challenge you have is that you're asking a sector that is implementing humanitarian response to hold itself accountable at the same time, right? And there are no other independent mechanisms to hold it accountable to complement that, right? And I think that's where we say the media plays an important role in this space to hold the sector accountable. But the media also faces its challenges because it does hold other sectors accountable. And in the case of Somalia, you know, whenever it's tried to hold or journalists try to hold the government to account, most of the time they end up in prisons, in jails. And it's actually a difficult job to be a media a media representative that can hold these actors to account. And I would assume it is going to be dangerous for anyone that tries to hold even the sector or powers to account. And so it is also about putting in place protection or adequate protection mechanisms for the actors that are going to hold any sector to account. But yes, I think as Mahad said, in the context of Somalia, there is nobody holding anyone to account, and that's the main problem, the main challenge. It doesn't mean that there's people that don't believe in it, but it is, you know, also how much difference can I make in this space? Even if I try to do this, how much change can I bring? And I think that is what demoralizes, I would say, people generally to go into that space. And that's how, you know, I think Meg started her introduction talking about motivation. The motivation to do this type of work is not, high enough or is not relevant enough. And I think that's where that's why I talked about a cultural shift that needs to happen for that to change. Thanks.
Can I quickly reflect on that? Because I think it's such an interesting discussion, and it reminds me of one of your other complex topics, which was this word accountability and if it's the right one. And I think this issue of, who could be playing this accountability role, or who could even use that word, is quite loaded in itself. Something we haven't touched on much is the whole geopolitical factor, which is obviously very prominent at the moment. Like, if you're using aid to win hearts and minds while spending billions on weapons, you probably inherently don't want a lot of scrutiny on your aid activities, because your aid activities are what make you the good guy, like you have enough problems. And so I think the former journalist in me thinks accountability is the word. The pragmatist in me knows that sometimes it's not the right one. And I think many of us, Sarah is in the room, like many of us have worked in situations where that isn't the word that you could use to get something done. In the Rohingya crisis, in Sulawesi, in some areas of Iraq. I think there's a real opportunity, again, in increasing public awareness about aid and geopolitics. And we sort of see that play out in a quite exciting way in things like the Instagram flurry on Gaza. We see it in civil society efforts currently to educate people on the complexities with aid and governance and resource extraction in the Congo. And maybe that helps sort of organically sort who should be pushing on accountability and maybe who shouldn't. If you're in harm's way, if you're making decisions about who may or may not get supplies to people facing starvation, maybe you don't have to use that accountability word. If you are part of an informed civil society who are very, very privileged and have the privilege of telling the truth, then you should be withholding that standard of accountability. So I think we just have to sort of take this discussion a bit beyond the aid bubble to see how it could be really used for the most impact.
Thank you. That's great. Do Abdurrahman or Mahad, do either of you want to come in again as well with any more comments? Otherwise, be prepared. I'm going to open it up to questions online and in the room. So any last comments? Mahad, any last comments before I open it up?
Yeah, very, very quickly, I agree with Meg on building community awareness. I think that's very important, and that can be done through different ways. And in the Somalia case, access to data and information is fairly challenging. There are a lot of information that are collected by the humanitarian organizations, but these are not publicly available. So access to information on humanitarian aid is fairly important. And I also think that the building some capacities at the in the media, such as journalists being able to analyze data and report and produce some reporting on humanitarian related data. I think that itself could be useful and important, and could provide useful information to the public, because even if there is data available and reports published, we don't have many journalists who are able to extract some interesting findings from this data and report to the public. And finally, I think, and as we have found in the study, that there is no dialogue and collaboration and even ways to exchange ideas among the civil society and the media, and I think creating such space where different stakeholders that somehow play a role in advancing transparency and accountability in Somalia come together and discuss what role they can play, how can they synergize their work. I think that's also an important thing that can do some positive change to the sector. Over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up now. We have a question online that I'm going to hand over to John. And just in the room, I'm happy, as I said, it's nice if this can be discussion based, because it's just much more interesting for us as well. So if you have a comment, a reflection, as well as a question for the panel, all of that is welcome. But first, John, to the question online.
Oh, yeah. So I'm just the mouthpiece for the online question. And I feel a little bit bad because all the panelists have urged us to get out of the humanitarian AAP bubble. And I feel like perhaps this question we're going back into it maybe. But I think it also relates a little bit to I think a few years ago there was a real emphasis on collective approaches to AAP. I have not kept track of that agenda, but was very aware of it a few years ago. The question is, could the panel elaborate on the risk of having hundreds, even thousands of separate feedback, complaints and accountability mechanisms in certain countries, rather than contributing to fostering accountability, could actually work to dilute it? So yeah, potentially sort of relevant to a perhaps a more collective approach to AAP agenda.
Just with that, I'm going to say I'd love to get Mahad's thoughts on multiple feedback platforms operating in Somalia, because I think you must have on the ground. I imagine that's quite an interesting picture, with not just the question of multiple platforms as the question sort of indicated, but multiple platforms coming from different actors, both within and outside of Somalia as well. So I don't know, Mahad, if you have any, sorry to force it on you, and then you guys can as well, but do you have any sort of thoughts on that sort of the existence of multiple different feedback platforms as a way to enable two-way communication, if that lack of a collective mechanism is a key challenge and having a collective one could address it? Or how do you sort of see that landscape of multiple different feedback platforms, some aiming to be collective, some individual, some project-based? What does that look like in terms of enabling or challenging accountability in Somalia?
Thanks, Stephen. I think that there are no such multiple feedback mechanisms in Somalia. There are organizations that have their own systems to get feedback from the interventions they make, but that as I said, it's not publicly available, and that it's only used for their own and feedback and programming for future projects. So I think maybe there are multiple feedback mechanisms in other countries, but in Somalia it's really not that contributing that much in this space, and that the organizations are doing this and alone, and there are no other independent initiatives in this regard.
Do either of you want to come in on?
Maybe I can jump in. I think there are talking, for example, not interagency, but one agency wise. I think there are 3 steps to the feedback mechanism. One is collecting it. The second one is categorizing the feedback into different areas. And the third one is, what do you do with that feedback? And one element of it is within the organization trying to adapt your programs to the feedback received. And the other one is communicating back to the communities, you know, what has been done with the feedback. From that perspective, I think what each agency needs to have is appropriate processes in place to manage that, and that takes resources that are human resources and financial resources. So it's also an expensive endeavor in that sense. But also, I think what needs to happen is that interagency level and through the appropriate coordination mechanism. I don't know, there's the information working group generally cluster that looks into that as to how that is impacting communities, whether it's making it more confusing, having to comply with different agency level, feedback mechanism. And how that can be harmonized. And I think that one is a more complicated question to answer, and not easy, because obviously do we know how the information you give is going to be used in that sense. So to that, I'd say I don't have an answer, but I think the answer should be in more coordination and more discussions around how we could improve those collective frameworks.
I'm coming quickly. This is a triggering theme for me. I think whether or not you have a single feedback mechanism or a collective one, the issue is you should do whatever has the most chance of influencing change. And so it's sort of hard to say one is better than the other. Like on one hand, if you want to address everyday questions or small complaints or fix problems, it's fine and it's helpful to do that at a micro level. If you want to streamline things or address sort of bigger issues, it makes sense to have a collective mechanism, of course, but the gap that we see across the board is action on that feedback. So there are multiple countries where there have been collective feedback mechanisms where thousands of feedback points have been lodged and no one knows what to do with them. There are some places where that has worked better than others. Like I think the Iraq call center got that it was doing quite well at the sort of follow-up after a while. But just from our vantage point of engaging with communities at sort of every level of feedback mechanisms, we get this like quite stressed and scathing feedback from people who already have quite stressful lives, who have bothered to lodge feedback through some mechanism or other. And their level of trust has gone down so much more by using that mechanism because no one did anything with the feedback. And at the sort of individual micro level, we have this quote from Congo where someone says, you know, we used to use this feedback mechanism and feedback suggestion boxes, but now we just feel so let down that we set them on fire. And the same thing can be seen from people who tell us things like there was this collective hotline and, you know, I was in Somalia and my phone didn't really work and I walked up a hill and I tried to lodge my feedback and it didn't work and I kept getting this like hold music. And so I think it's, you know, before we sort of start thinking, how do we need to scale up these grand feedback mechanisms, you need to ask at whatever level that's operating, where is the potential for this to actually be accountable and to influence change? And if it is a collective feedback mechanism, a lot of those changes are going to be harder to implement because they're not as easy as, you know, I've broken my tent or whatever. And so do you have a response where the whole sort of leadership system is ready to listen to that feedback and make changes based on it? And in most places, they kind of don't have that in place in any kind of real way. So yeah, I just think there's a lot of work to be done before you can really say, oh, this feedback mechanism is better than this feedback mechanism.
Thank you. And again, that directs us back to some of those bigger questions too about what's the change that we're looking for, and that rather than starting with the mechanism, starting with what are we aiming for the accountability. I want to open up to the room as well before I go online. Does anyone have any thoughts, comments, reflections? Yes, please. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I work for NORCAP. Yeah, as Beck says, I think this word accountability is really interesting. Accountability doesn't really translate into many other languages, doesn't really translate that well across the nexus either. So even when we're talking to people who may be our peers, it doesn't really mean anything to them. An awful lot of it is just around good programming, and that's what it should be, instead of us kind of overcomplicating it. I think it's really interesting, and I've been doing a lot more work with kind of climate and energy, peacekeeping actors, sort of people who are sort of in the sphere but aren't classic humanitarians. And they're like, wait, but isn't that just good programming? I'm like, yeah. And when it get, you know, some elements are a bit more technical within the basket of goods, and if you're looking at feedback mechanisms and protection and data management and things, it does require a slightly different element of skills. But an awful lot of it, we just focus so much on the feedback and the technicality of it and forget about the information provision and the participation and the listening and the face-to-face and the daily action, that I think that it causes us damage. I think that was more of a comment than a question, but it's interesting seeing even the title of this session still being a title of a session at HMPW. Thank you.
Yes, yes, thank you. That comment's appreciated. I'm gonna take one more comment, reflection, and then I'll go back to our panelists. Want to just please? Yes, please. In the back.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ring Garwich. I'm a National Director for Child Testing and Development Organization from South Sudan. Actually, I'm happy to hear from my colleague there in Somalia because the situation of accountability is similar also to what we have, especially in terms of implementing what you have received, for example, whether it's a complaint or is something like that. And the issue is when you have a community that doesn't know anything and you know something. So I'm coming here to personal values or values of the organization, for example. Because if you know that this community doesn't know anything and you take advantage of their ignorance, this one also makes somebody to be guilty. Because if I know something, I have to tell those people or that person that, yes, you have to do it like this. So here your conscience is the one that is judging you, not the policies of the organization. So we have different experiences, like what happening in Somalia. So what I'm saying is that individuals who are in the organization, if they see something bad in the community or they see something good in the community, it is good for them to show the way how are they going to do this, because we realize that exploitation sometimes is there, and also manipulation. You know what you should do, but you avoid not to do it. So here I'm talking about those who have power or resources. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. As you say, it's a difficult question thinking around, the resource and power imbalance that exists and what people do with it. Any one last comments? Please. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aya, and I work for Impact. Yeah, thanks a lot. That was a really interesting panel, and I have it's more of a comment. And I to kind of reflect a little bit on what Meg was saying around the geopolitics of kind of like the whole kind of accountability part, and something that I've been kind of reflecting a little bit on. And I think, I mean, as we obviously all know, I mean, the biggest kind of funders of aid are also like the biggest kind of like violators of aid. And I feel like in these conferences in general and in the accountability space in general, like we don't reflect so much on the big picture. And it tends to be really like very consensual, I find, the debates, and very much around like the nitty-gritty of like, oh, what kind of accountability mechanisms we want to use, etc., rather than the big picture. And I think I also come from Syria, and I feel like whenever I'm back, I mean, I talk to people, everyone is very skeptical about aid. So I happen to be also on the other side, and I think, like, I don't feel like we need to do more to promote aid, right? Because people in these communities know that this is maybe not the solution to their problems. And I don't think, like we need to, to do more to promote that. And I think maybe part of the discussion should be about kind of like looking more at the big picture and saying, okay, maybe aid is not always part of the solutions. And we need to talk, especially within the accountability spaces. And I find that there is very little kind of discussion about some of the root kind of problems of aid and the humanitarian kind of sector in general. And, we should also follow where the money comes from, right? Like if we don't really tackle the root causes. And I find like it would be really interesting, and I'd love to hear a little bit more from speakers around kind of just being less consensual, I think, about accountability in general, and how can we also think about that as well. Sorry, more of a long-winded comment, but would love to hear thoughts on that.
No, that's excellent. I mean, obviously everyone in this room has things to say on this topic as well too, so that's really appreciated. I'm going to hand back to my panelists for last comments, unless there's anyone else that has a comment or question. Okay, great. So I'm going to start, we're going to go the reverse order. Abdurrahman, I'll start with you. Any final reflections in response to those comments, or any sort of last points that you sort of like to leave people with thinking about around this issue of how do we take forward the accountability agenda in a more meaningful way?
No, I think just to the comments that our colleague from Impact just mentioned, I think, and Meg earlier, is that we live in a space where people are affected or know what's happening at international level. know what's happening in Gaza and are affected or have strong views on that, I would say. In my region, obviously, you know that there are strong sentiments against certain powers, global powers, and some may say it's not justified, but some may say that, you know, it has been an abuse of resources, natural resources that has been happening and unaccounted for in that region, which has, you know, led to what is happening right now. And we're more focused on the fact that, you know, we have certain regime changes rather than, you know, the core issue, which is, you know, why this happened. And this is at the back of strong sentiments from young populations who believe that, you know, international powers are not doing the right things and have been abusing their countries. And that is affecting the aid, that is affecting how we're perceived on the ground, and we can't distance ourselves from that. I think it's very important to say. And I'm also from Somalia, and I know that working when I was in the NGO sector, it was very difficult to have conversations because people have extremely negative views about the aid system, right? And, you know, with all the good we do, there are also many negative perceptions that we tend to ignore. And I think, you know, we can't ignore that anymore because it affects, you know, our operations, it affects how we're perceived, and it has also a risk impact to that extent. To my colleague from South Sudan, you know, I think, you know, he concluded his remarks by saying it's all about power, and that's how we should start the conversation from. It is about how we give away our power, and I don't think we're ready to give it away yet on the discourse of localization, which is, you know, all about giving away power. It is about changing the system. It is about revolutionizing the system. And although you have many organizations and many entities that, you know, have committed to it, you have still people in the system that are still reserved about it. There are still people in the system that do not want to be held accountable. And that, you know, is a challenge that we need to address. And you know, we shouldn't also hold back from the fact that there are still colonial attitudes that dominate the way we work, right? And that is why when my brother from South Sudan says, you know, that people don't listen to communities, it is those attitudes where we think that communities, we are better than communities, we know better than what they think, we know better than what I said, that, you know, make a difference. But it's only when communities really feel that they're heard, that they can make a difference, that will change perceptions on the ground. So there are, we can't ignore those perceptions, but I think the problems we have as actors is that we are so busy in our day-to-day work, in making sure that, you know, we meet our deadlines, we meet our KPIs, we meet our burn rates, we meet our reporting, you know, commitments, that we don't have that time to reflect around these issues, or the reflection happens at the top level and not, you know, at the bottom. And I think those are the dynamics that we need to reflect on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Maha, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Just final remarks. I think Somalia has been an aid-dependent country for decades now. And I think that has also created this huge dependency on aid in the country. So I agree with that participant final remarks on question ourselves, is aid really the solution? How long can we continue being dependent on aid, humanitarian aid, emergency aid? And why don't we focus more on preventing these vulnerabilities, building the structures, and that make us resilient and adaptive to these climate change and other you know, challenge that create humanitarian emergencies in Somalia. And I think that is where thinking and efforts and investment should go And if that happens, I think the level of humanitarian aid in Somalia will decline, and that we might have the bandwidth to discuss how the little interventionists, humanitarian interventionists, can be more effective and be more accountable. But at the moment, the entire country is dependent on humanitarian aid. The government budget is expecting 70% of it from project support and budgetary support from outside, and that means there is no really any bandwidth and interest in discussing accountability, because we need them, we need their presence, we need their money, we need their in-kind or cash support. So I think thinking of and building the necessary infrastructure that would enable us being resilient on climate change and other disasters would really play a key role in reducing the amount of humanitarian aid in Somalia. Thank you.
Thank you. And Meg for the last word.
Thank you very much. I don't know that I have anything smarter than those interventions to say, so I might just steal other people's commentary. I mean, I think first of all, Sarah's point about, just doing better programming and be honest about what we're doing is a really key one. I think the other thing, just based on this conversation, is the reminder to be more savvy about understanding and considering the context in which aid exists, and that it never exists in a vacuum. But the final point that I will steal is I really liked what the colleague from Impact said. We just did a staff survey at Ground Truth, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for breaching confidentiality here, but one of the comments on what Ground Truth could do better was someone said, we need to be careful about criticising people who are working really hard and focus on criticising the systems in which they exist. And hopefully we're doing that. But I think any of us who sort of have the privilege to be in this room or in this conversation should certainly focus there and keep asking better questions to the right people, if we're not going to be put at risk by doing so. Like, we live in an age where people are jailed and tortured for asking questions. So if you're not, I would say just keep asking them.
Well, thank you. I'm going to leave it there and just say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you as well. We will be writing a short reflection note on this session, which we will share. So look out for that as well. But thank you very much. And thank you, Meg, Mahad, and Abdurrahman.